Hilchos Korban Pesach Perek Shishi, the laws of the Passover sacrifice, chapter 6. One of the people who gets pushed from the first Pesach to the second Pesach is Tameh, a person who's ritually impure. If a person finds himself on the day before Pesach ritually impure, he's not able to bring the Passover sacrifice on time, so he gets pushed to 1 month later when he has a second chance to bring a Pesach Sheni, as we learned the other day. The question is, what type of ritual impurity makes that push happen? The next book coming up in the Rambam is a book all about the laws of ritual impurity. There's 150 ways to become impure. Is every type big enough or significant enough that it pushes you from the first Pesach to the second Pesach? As we're going to see, no. Only specific types of ritual impurity will cause you to be pushed from one to the other. Another type of ritual impurity might not. And that's going to be the bulk of the subject of today's chapter. As an aside, we're also going to have a very interesting conversation on the authority of the rabbis. Sometimes the rabbis can put in place a decree which will end up canceling a biblical mitzvah if certain parameters are met. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion on that in today's chapter, when or in which situations the rabbis can override a mitzvah fulfillment and in which cases they cannot. But again, the bulk of it, or the main conversation, is what type of ritual impurity pushes you from the first to the second Pesach. It's important to point out that many of the concepts we're going to be discussing in this chapter are going to be elaborated upon at much more length in the next book when we actually discuss the laws of ritual impurity. Here, we're only going to define them in short, in the context of understanding the Korban Pesach. So even if we don't get all the details and all the types of impurity, that's fine. Know that we're going to get to the full length of it when we explore the impurities themselves in the Rambam's next book. Halacha Aleph says the Rambam, Ezehu tamei shenitche lePesach sheni. What is called a ritually impure person, or which type of ritually impure person is pushed from the first Passover to the second? Says the Rambam, the defining principle is, Kol mi she'eina yachol lecha leshaPesach beleile chamisha asar b'Nisan mipnei tumasei. Anybody who on the 15th night of Nisan, the night of Pesach, would not be able to eat the Passover sacrifice because of his impurity. As we're going to see, there are different types of impurity imposed by different types of objects or things. There's what's called tumas shiva. Sometimes an experience or a contact with something can cause tuma for 7 days. You become impure, and you have to count a 7-day duration before you can become pure. Other cases of tuma are called tumas erev. They're just tuma until the evening. As long as you go to mikveh that day and you wait for sunset, once sunset hits, you're good to go. So basically, if a person finds himself on the 14th day of Nisan with a tumas erev, with a tuma that only applies till the evening, so by the time the evening comes around, by the time the 15th night of Nisan comes around, he will be able to eat from the Passover sacrifice because he'll have gone to mikveh and the sun will have set, his purity will be complete. But anybody who's in a 7-day impurity or more, in some cases, you have to wait for more, because let's say you have to find 7 clean days. So you could be impure for a few days, then begin the count of 7 clean days later. Or even if it's less, the point is it's more than 1 day. You can't get rid of it before the evening, so then you're a person who is tameh and is pushed off to the next Pesach. Could go in zavim v'zavais. Classic example would be a zav or a zava. Zav or a zava is a man or a woman who has an irregular discharge from the reproductive organ. For a man, it's more like a gonorrheal discharge, and for a woman, it's an irregular blood flow, not during the time of the period. Both of these cases, they become tameh, and they have to count 7 clean days. There's no way that night, the night of the 15th, they'll be able to eat from the Korban Pesach. Another example would be nidos, a woman who's on her period, or menstrual cycle. She also becomes tameh for 7 days, as we saw in the Rambam's 5th book. V'yoldos, a woman who gives birth. There's a whole period of impurity after giving birth. Ubayale nidos, and also those who have relations with a woman who is menstruating, in which case they also become impure, like a nida. On that high level, they cannot become totally pure by that evening. They won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach, and therefore they're pushed from the first Pesach to the second. But if somebody were to touch a carcass of an animal or a dead rodent, the specific 8 rodents mentioned in the Torah that transmit impurity, or anything like that, on the day of the 14th, these are all cases of what we call tumas erev. As long as you go to the mikveh and sunset passes, you're good. Harezet toivil. So what should the person do? He should go to the mikveh on the 14th. And after he goes to the mikveh, they can slaughter the Passover sacrifice for him. He can be included in a Passover sacrifice group. And in the evening, when the sun sets, he can eat the Passover sacrifice. There's no need to push him from the first Pesach to the second Pesach. The question is, what if one of these 2 scenarios interplay? What if you have somebody who is impure for an extended period of time, but today, the 14th of Nisan, is their last day? So by the time the evening comes, if they do everything right, they will be able to eat from the Passover sacrifice. Do they fit into the category that is now allowed to have the Pesach Rishon, or do they have to wait till the Pesach Sheni? The first case we consider is a case of somebody who is Tamei Meis. Tamei Meis is somebody who is impure from contact with a corpse. The law of somebody, basically, I'm giving you just the basics. Somebody who comes in contact with a corpse, the basic law is he's impure for 7 days, during which, on the 3rd and the 7th day, he has to be sprinkled by the ash water mixture of the para aduma. Para aduma is the red heifer. We're going to have a whole section of laws on it in the next book. Basically, once every couple of generations, there was only 9 of them in the whole of Jewish history, they had a red heifer. They would burn it, turn it into ash, store the ash away. Every time somebody became impure from corpse impurity, they would mix some of this ash with some water in a very special procedure, again, not getting into the details here, and sprinkle it in a special ceremony onto the person who became impure. 3rd and 7th days from his impurity. So what happens if you have a Tamei Meis? Shechol Shvi Shalei Barba Asar, his 7th day, the last day, is on the 14th of Nisan. Technically speaking, he can go to the mikveh today, get the ash water sprinkled on him, and he'll be good to go in the evening. Says the Rambam, still it doesn't work. Afal pisha tov al v'huza alav. Even if he goes to the mikveh, and the ash water of the para aduma is sprinkled on him, and he is thereby fit to eat sacrificial meat that night. In the case of the Passover sacrifice, we do not slaughter the Passover sacrifice for him. He is pushed off to the second Pesach. How do we know this? We know this from the original story of Pesach Sheni. The whole idea of having a second Pesach was instituted because there were people who were impure the first time around, and they asked what should they do, and they were told that they're pushed off a month. What kind of impurity did they have? Says the Rambam, Shenemar, it says, there were people that were impure to a soul of a person. They were impure from a corpse. And they were not able to perform the Passover sacrifice on that day. We learn from tradition, we have a tradition directly from Moshe Rabbeinu, that this was the story. The story was that they became impure from a corpse 7 days before. This day, the Erev Pesach, was their 7th day. And about this exact question they were asking, whether they should slaughter the Passover sacrifice for them, and they'll be able to eat it in the evening. And Moshe Rabbeinu explained the law that no, in this case, they cannot have the Passover sacrifice slaughtered for them. They have to be pushed to the next Pesach. By the way, the Rambam doesn't say how we know. How do we know? Obviously, we know from tradition. But one of the ways we see it in the verse is the extra words, Bayoim Hahu. They were not able to make the Passover sacrifice on that day, which means the very next day, they would have been able to. This was the last day. This was the last problematic day. Only on that day they weren't able to make the Passover sacrifice. The next day they would have been. Nevertheless, said Moshe Rabbeinu, Pesach Sheni is the way to go. You got to wait 1 more month. Medvarim Amurim, says the Rambam, however, there's a caveat. When do we say that a person who is a Tamei Meis, a person who is impure from a corpse, may not have the Passover sacrifice slaughtered for him, even if his 7th day is Erev Pesach? If he became impure from a corpse in such a way that would cause a Nazirite to have to shave. What does this mean? In the Rambam's 6th book, we had a section of laws called the laws of the Nazirite. A person takes a vow, he's not going to drink wine, not going to shave his head, not going to come into contact with a corpse. If he does, he needs to destroy his entire term, shave his head, and begin again. But as the Rambam explained in that set of laws, there are different degrees of corpse impurity. There's contact with an actual corpse. There's contact with, let's say, just bones, ground bones, decomposed. There was a whole bunch of categories that we explored in one of the chapters in the laws of Nazarite. And the Rambam explained over there that there are different levels. Only if you come into contact with higher levels of impurity does the Nazirite have to shave his head and completely cancel his term. The lower level corpse impurities don't cause the Nazirite to have to shave his head and destroy his term in all cases. So the Rambam is using that differentiation and applying it here as well. Only if a person became impure with such a degree of corpse impurity, the stricter degree, that type which would cause a Nazirite to shave, that's when, even if the 7th day is Erev Pesach and technically he can go to the mikveh and be done with it by night, we still don't slaughter it for him. But if he was impure from contact with a corpse in a lower way, in a way that would not cause a Nazirite to shave over them, then if the seventh day happens to be Erev Pesach, shoichatin alav b'shvi'i shalai. We could slaughter the Korban Pesach for him on his seventh day. Of course, achar sheyidbil the yuza alav. Of course, after he goes to the mikveh and has the ash water of the parah aduma sprinkled on him. And once the sun sets, he'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach because it's a lower level of impurity. The story of Pesach Sheni from which we learned that they couldn't, that was because they had actually come into contact with the higher level of the corpse. Halacha Gimel. Let's talk about some other types of impurities, not impurity from a corpse. Zav. You have a zav. A zav is again a gonorrheal type of discharge, an irregular discharge from the reproductive organ. The halacha typically is, and again, just getting the surface details here. If a man experiences one such emission, he becomes what's called a bal keri, and as long as he goes to the mikveh, after one day, he's done, he's good, pure. But once he experiences two emissions, that transfers him from a bal keri into a zav, and now, in order to become pure, he needs to have 7 days where he's completely clean with no emissions. If he has 3 such emissions, not only does he have to count 7 days, he has to also bring a sacrifice afterwards to complete his purity. So here we're going to be talking about zav shara shtei re'iyos, a zav who experienced 2 sightings. So he's out of the status of a bal keri, he's already a full zav, and therefore he needs to count 7 days. V'safar shiva yamim, v'tavo b'shvi. He counts the 7 days. He already went to the mikveh on the 7th day, and now this day is Erev Pesach. So of course, if he was in the middle of the 7 days, he wouldn't be able to get rid of his impurity by that night, so he would fall into the category of the Tameh, who gets pushed from first to second Pesach Sheni. But the question over here is, like the Tameh Mace in the last halacha, it's his last day. Technically, if all goes well, tonight he can eat sacrifices. Says the Rambam, unlike a Tameh Mace, who we would not do this for, here we would. We can slaughter the Passover sacrifice for him, and he will be able to eat that night. What happens if tragically, let's say Erev Pesach was the 7th day. He goes to the mikveh in the morning, he's very hopeful, everything is looking good. Slaughter the Passover sacrifice in the afternoon. 10 minutes before sunset, he has another emission, another sighting. His 7th day was not complete without sightings. But the blood of his Passover sacrifice has already been sprinkled. Says the Rambam, Pater milases Pesach Sheni. Of course, he's back to being impure. There's no way he can eat from the Passover sacrifice tonight. But because when the Passover sacrifice was brought for him, he was in a kosher state potentially, he's exempt from doing the Pesach Sheni. A similar case would be Shemeres Yom Keneged Yom, a woman who is guarding a clean day opposite an impure day. This goes into the laws of the Zava, the woman who experiences an irregular blood flow. Again, surface details, we explored this at length in the Rambam's 5th book, but the bottom line of it is, if a woman experiences a flow of blood not during the time of her period, for one day, one sighting, all she has to do is wait till the next morning, go to the mikveh in the hopes that it's going to be a clean day, and if it is a clean day and she has no further sighting of blood, she's permitted back to her husband, totally pure after that one day. Truth is, even if it happens a second time, she can do the same thing, as long as she's shemeres yoim. She guards one clean day to make up for the impure day, she's good. So what would happen in this scenario of Pesach? Let's say she saw the blood on the 13th of Nisan. So the 14th of Nisan is hopefully going to be a clean day. So what does she do? Tevelas b'yom hashimor, she'll go to the mikveh on this day of guarding, as we explained in the laws of forbidden relationships, in the hopes that it's going to be a clean day. Then you can slaughter the Passover sacrifice for her, and she eat in the evening. If tragically, let's say after the blood is sprinkled for the Passover sacrifice, now she has another blood flow later in the day. So because the sacrifice was brought for her in a kosher time, she's exempt from making a second Pesach because she took care of her original obligation. The fact that blood came later is only of consequence with regard to impurity, but not with regard to the laws of the Passover sacrifice. Different to this would be a nida. A woman who is a nida, a regular menstrual cycle, is impure for 7 days. Even if her 7th day was on Erev Pesach, we would not slaughter the Passover sacrifice for her. We don't slaughter the Passover sacrifice for a menstruating woman even on her 7th day. Because the woman who is a nida only goes to the mikveh on the night following the 7th day. And she cannot eat sacrificial meat till the next night. So she wouldn't fit into that original definition in the beginning of the chapter, a person who is fit to eat the Passover sacrifice that night. She's not. Mikvah is only going to happen that night. And sacrificial meat only the next night. And therefore, we don't slaughter for a nida in that scenario. Halacha dalad mechusrei kippurim, somebody who needs to bring a sacrifice to complete their purity. I mentioned an example before, a zav who has 3 sightings. Besides for counting 7 clean days and going to the mikvah, he has to wait another day to bring a sacrifice. And only when he brings a sacrifice is the purity complete. So let's say, mechusrei kippurim, you have people who are, literally means lacking atonement. That means they have to bring a sacrifice to complete their purity. Shechol yem avas korban nesein bar ba'asar. The day of their bringing the sacrifice falls out to be on the 14th. So again, technically, if all goes well, by that night they'll be able to eat sacrificial meat. Sheichatin aleyan, we slaughter it for them, the Passover sacrifice. Umakrivin korban nesein bar ba'asar b'nisan, and we offer their sacrifice, their purity sacrifice, on the 14th of Nisan, ben koidem shchitas haPesach, ben achar shchitas, whether before or after the slaughtering of the Passover sacrifice. Va'ichlin pischein la'erev, and they can eat their Passover sacrifice that evening, no problem. With one exception or one caveat, ve'ein sheichatin aleyan, we do not slaughter the Passover sacrifice for them ad sheyimseru korban nesein biyad beis din, until they hand over their personal purity sacrifices into the hands of the court, because then we know it's guaranteed. Shema yifshu v'lo yakrivu esam. Otherwise, maybe they're going to be negligent. They're not going to offer them. Once they hand it off to the court, now we know it's going to be taken care of, and now you can slaughter Passover sacrifice for them, and they can eat it that night. Halacha hey mitzayra shechal shmini shaloi liyes barba asar. A mitzayra, a person who has tsaras lesions, whose 8th day falls out to be on the 14th of Nisan. What does this mean? A person gets tsaras lesions. Once he sees that the lesions are gone, he's inspected by a Kohen, and the process of purity begins. The process of purity goes for 8 days. He shaves, waits 7 days, shaves again, and then on the 8th day brings a sacrifice. On that 8th day, once a sacrifice is brought, he's fully pure. Now, in order, this is where the interesting conversation that I mentioned in the beginning of the chapter comes in. In order for the mitzayra to have his sacrifice brought, he needs to be present, at least in the women's courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. He needs to be watching. So now, follow this. A mitzayra's 8th day falls out to be on Erev Pesach. If all goes well, he should be able to bring the sacrifices today and become fully pure. The problem is, Vira keri boy bayom. He experienced a emission of semen on that day, which makes him into a Baal Keri. Now, why is that a problem? Because now he has a secondary degree of impurity on him. Remember, he's taking care of his tzaras. Today is his last day. And now he has to take care of this. How do you take care of this? You go to the mikveh. And when you go to the mikveh, that makes you into a tvul yom. A tvul yom means somebody who went to the mikveh by day and is waiting for sunset to complete his purity. Now, rabbinically, follow all the details here, rabbinically, a tvul yom cannot go in to certain areas in the temple premises, including the area where this same person needs to get to in order to complete the purification process of tzaras. If we're going to listen to the rabbinic decree and not allow this person in there, that means he won't be able to get rid of his tzaras today, which means he won't be able to bring a Passover sacrifice. So you basically have a rabbinic injunction getting in the way of fulfilling a biblical mitzvah. So the Rambam says we don't do that. Harei zeh toivel, the person for the secondary degree of impurity should go to the mikveh, v'nichnas le'ezras nashim u'meivi korban esav, and go right in to the women's courtyard where usually he cannot go rabbinically. He'll go in and bring his sacrifices to take care of the tzaras impurity. Even though typically it's forbidden for a tvul yom to go into the women's courtyard. It says the Rambam, since the whole prohibition is only rabbinic, as we explained in the laws, in the last book of entering the temple structure in a non-permitted way. And this day is the day to bring the Passover sacrifice in its proper time. Let the positive biblical commandment, which carries excision as a penalty, and let it come and override the rabbinic prohibition of not going in to the temple courtyard. Halacha vav, let's see another example where this rabbinic biblical face-off will happen. A person who is impure from a corpse, and his 7th day, the final day where he should become pure, falls out to be on Shabbos. The halacha generally is, ein mazin alav ela lemachar. We don't do the sprinkling of the ash water of the parah aduma that day. It's forbidden rabbinically to sprinkle those ash waters on Shabbos, and we do it the next day. It's a typical case. We'll keep the person in an impurity for one more day. But what if it interplays with the Passover sacrifice? Even if the seventh day falls out to be the 13th of Nisan, the day before you're supposed to bring the Passover sacrifice, and it's a Shabbos, he'll be pushed off to the next day, Sunday, the 14th of Nisan, which will cause that's going to be his final day. That's the day we'll sprinkle the ash water of the Parah Aduma on him. And if so, we're not going to be able to slaughter the Passover sacrifice for him, as we explained in the beginning of the chapter, that a Tmei Meis is unique, that his last day, he doesn't get to have the Passover sacrifice offered for him. He'll be pushed off to the second Pesach. Now, 1 second. How did we get to this push-off? Because you had a rabbinic injunction against sprinkling the water on Shabbos. But in this case, where it's going to lead to the cancellation of bringing the Passover sacrifice in its time, why don't we override the rabbinic injunction? The prohibition of sprinkling on Shabbos is only rabbinic. The bringing the Passover sacrifice in the right time is excision. How do they place their words, the rabbis put their injunction in a place of excision? Says the Rambam, it's a different kind of clash here. The clash isn't happening on the same day. The day on which the issue of sprinkling the ash water comes up, the day of prohibition, is not the time when the sacrifice is supposed to be brought. That's the next day. Therefore, the rabbis can place their words in their place, even if in the future it's going to cause that it's going to get in the way of excision. If they're both on the same day, like in the last case of the Mitzvah, so then the rabbis cannot cancel the biblical mitzvah. But if there's a rabbinic injunction here, and the biblical mitzvah is an effect of an effect that's going to happen the next day, no, the rabbis can keep their decree in place, even if it causes later biblical consequences. A Jew uncircumcised, he gets a bris on the day before Pesach. Wonderful. We can slaughter the Passover sacrifice for him immediately after the bris. But if a person converts on the 14th of Nisan and goes through the circumcision and the immersion on that day, we cannot slaughter a Passover sacrifice for this fresh convert on this day. He won't be allowed to eat the Passover sacrifice that evening. We consider him like somebody who just separated himself from a grave, or needs to have 7 days and only then become pure. Why? Why is there this decree? A regular Jew circumcises, he's fine. A convert circumcises, he's not fine. There's a rabbinic decree. The decree is Shema Yitma Gerzel Lemeis Lashana Haba'a B'Yoyim Arba'a. So it's very possible that this same convert will become impure to a corpse the very next year on the very same day, 14th of Nisan. V'Yitbel V'Yoychal and he'll go to the mikveh and he'll eat the Passover sacrifice that day. V'Yoymar, assuming he'll say mistakenly, Eshtakad kachasuli Yisrael, kishamalti, tavalti, v'achalti la'erev. That's what the Jews did to me last year. I had a bris, I went to the mikveh, I ate that night. And he won't remember that was because it was a conversion issue. Here, this is a ritual impurity issue. Therefore, we say, you know what, as soon as you convert, you're ritually impure, wait 7 days, don't do the Passover sacrifice right away. Now, how could this be? Same question. The injunction here is rabbinic. Not bringing a Passover sacrifice in its time is excision. How could they place their words in a place of excision? And it's the same day. On the same day of the sacrifice, 14th. Says the Rambam, because this whole situation came into being in a non-ideal fashion. What was the case we gave? The person converted, did the bris and the mikvah on the same day. That's not supposed to happen in a regular conversion. A convert only becomes obligated in mitzvahs after circumcision and immersion. As we explained in the content of conversion, in the beginning of the Rambam's 5th book, a convert is not supposed to go to the mikvah until he's fully healed from the bris. Therefore, in this case, where he didn't do that, he went to the mikvah and immediately immersed, the rabbis can put their injunction in place. The person who had the bris, this convert, could have waited with the mikvah till he gets healed, and he never would have come to an obligation at all. He wouldn't have to be in a situation where he has to bring a Passover sacrifice. He put himself in that situation, so the rabbis can say, hey, you know what, our decree is in place, you wait 7 days, don't bring the first Passover, bring the second one. Halacha ches, misha ba bebeis hapras. Very interesting halacha. A person comes into what's called a beis hapras. A beis hapras is a field where there's a grave somewhere you don't know where it is. It's in doubt. The rabbis impose the level of impurity on somebody who walks through a beis hapras. What happens if a person's traveling to Jerusalem, he wants to bring the Passover sacrifice, and he comes to a beis hapras? If he listens to the rabbis and doesn't go through it, he's going to violate a biblical prohibition of bringing the Passover sacrifice in its time. So the rabbis made a little loophole. They said, "Hareza min hapeach v'hoilech." He can blow his way through, as this guy is doing here. Blow his way through the beis hapras. V'im lo matza etzem v'lo nitma. If he doesn't find a bone, a remnant of a grave, and he didn't become impure through any contact with any part of a human skeleton, sheichet v'yichel pischei v'afal pi shalach lebeis hapras. He can go to Yerushalayim, slaughter and eat his Passover sacrifice, even though he walked through a beis hapras, which is a rabbinic impurity, but it's only rabbinic. Shatumas beis hapras midivreim. The whole impurity of a beis hapras is rabbinic, as we're going to explain in the laws of somebody who is impure by a corpse. As just explained, the rabbis never place their injunction if it's violating a prohibition of excision. Also, if you have a beis hapras that was trod upon, that means many people walked over it. It's initially considered pure for somebody looking to make a Passover sacrifice. No need to even blow your way through. You just walk right through it, because once people step in it a lot, there's probably no bones in the immediate access area, and you're probably not even going to become impure. So the rabbis don't put their decree in a place of biblical mitzvahs. Halacha tes ha'oinein, a person who is in deep mourning. Deep mourning means before burial of a dead relative. Person passes away. For the daytime during the passing, before the burial, the person is considered to be an oinen. That night, by biblical law, he's no longer an oinen, but by rabbinic law, he is. So technically, for these purposes, a person who's in deep mourning is fit to eat the Passover sacrifice that night, because the whole idea of being an oinen by night is rabbinic. The rabbis do not place their injunction in a place of prohibition of excision in this case. They slaughter it for him, he goes to the mikveh, and he can eat. Why the mikvah? So he should be, in his mind, separate from the mourning state and not divert his mind to other things which could distract him and get him impure. So he's fine. But when do we say this? If the relative died after midday, when he already had the obligation to bring a Passover sacrifice. He's already obligated to bring the Passover sacrifice. But if the dead person, relative, died before midday, there's no slaughtering the Passover sacrifice for him. To begin with, he's pushed off to the second Pesach because he can never become pure enough or out of the mourning state before Pesach begins. If after the fact they slaughtered him, they sprinkled the blood, he could go to the mikvah and eat it that night. If a person's relative passed away on the 13th of Nisan and he buries him the next day, the 14th, on the day of the burial, he's a rabbinic oinen. But it doesn't go into the night, it doesn't extend to the next night rabbinically. Therefore, they can slaughter the Passover sacrifice for him, he can go to the mikvah, eat it that night, and eat other sacrificial meat as well that night. Because it's totally not oinen anymore, even rabbinically. The day of hearing and the day of gathering bones. This means a person hears after a while that a relative passed away, or he's exhuming the bones and moving them to a different place for whatever reason. It's considered like a new burial. Therefore, if somebody is gathering the bones of a relative on the day of the 14th of Nisan, that's the day he hears for the first time that a relative passed away, you can slaughter it for him, he can go to the mikveh and eat the sacrificial meat that night, because again, not even rabbinically is there any level of mourning that night, it's all during the day. Halacha Yud, a person, there was an avalanche, a person is digging through the stones to find perhaps there's a dead body there. You cannot slaughter a Passover sacrifice for him. Maybe there's going to be a dead person discovered in the pile, which would mean retroactively the person digging was impure during the time of slaughtering the sacrifice. If after the fact they slaughtered for him and there's no person found, no dead body found, he can eat, partake of the Passover sacrifice that night. If a dead person was found there after the blood was sprinkled of the Passover sacrifice, if it's clear to him that he was impure during sprinkling time, it was around pile of stones. So wherever he was on top of the dead body. That means that retroactively it's revealed that the Passover sacrifice slaughtered for him was done in an improper way. He's obligated to the second Passover. But if it's a doubt, maybe he wasn't standing above the impurity during the time of sprinkling the blood. It's very possible he only became impure after the blood was sprinkled in Jerusalem. He's exempt from the second Passover. Halacha Yud Aleph, we return to a topic we also had in the laws of the Nazarite, Tumas HaTahoim. Tumah of the depths means it's a tumah that nobody knew about before it was discovered. Misha Avar Baderech, a person passes by a road, Umatzu Meis Mushkav L'Rachba Shal Derech, and they find a dead body lying on the width of the road. So most probably you passed over it or touched it and became impure. Im Haya HaMeis Tumas HaTahoim, says the Rambam. If the dead body was a category of tumah of the depths, nobody knew about it before, Afal Pishu Tami L'Truma, even though if you were a Kohen, he'd be considered impure enough that he cannot partake of truma. He's considered pure with regards to the Passover sacrifice. He can slaughter it and eat it. Even though it's possible that he touched it. Since it's a tumah of the depths, he's pure for Pesach. Special law. Even if the skeleton is complete, he was from end to end of the road. He can perform the Pesach unless he knows for sure that he touched it. Innocent till proven guilty. When can you rely on this? When he was walking on his feet, where it's possible you didn't touch the dead body, maybe you just sidestepped it. But if you were riding or carrying a load, it's impure even if it was a tumah of the depths. When you're carrying something and you're riding, it's impossible you didn't touch it, you didn't move it, you didn't become a tent over it, pass over it. So therefore you're impure. We already explained the principles of tumah of the depths in the laws of the Nazarite. Yud Beis Misha Asa Pesach Becheskas Shutar. A person performs the Passover sacrifice under the assumption that he's pure. And then he finds out he was impure from a tumah of the depths. He's not obligated even for the second Pesach. This is a law, direct tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. But if he discovers that he was impure with an impurity that he could have known about, it wasn't tumah of the depths, he is obligated to make the Pesach Sheni. A person became impure from a dead body and he did the sprinkling of the ash water third day and seventh day properly. On the seventh day, without knowing, he becomes impure to a grave tumah of the depths. He does the Passover sacrifice thinking that he's pure. Then he finds out that there was a tumah of the depths. He's not obligated to a second Pesach. We don't attribute it back to the original corpse impurity. That one's done. Once it goes to the mikvah on the seventh day, the first impurity is over. But if he would have become impure from tumah of the depths on the sixth day of his impurity, while the original corpse impurity was still hanging over him, but he only found out until he made the Passover sacrifice, he's obligated in Pesach Sheni, we assume he's still impure. A person who is presumed to be impure is impure till you're for sure pure, because there's a basis for the matter. Once you're in the presumption under the umbrella of being impure, you're considered impure till you're for sure out of that league. Guilty until proven innocent.